History at War: How Putin Uses Historical Justice to Justify the Ukraine Invasion. Russia didn't just invade Ukraine with tanks and missiles, it invaded with history. Vladimir Putin claims he's not attacking a sovereign country, he's restoring historical justice. But what does that actually mean? Is history being used as truth or a weapon? Let's break it down. Chapter 1. The Idea of Historical Justice. When Putin talks about Ukraine, he rarely begins with politics or NATO. He starts with history, claiming Russians and Ukrainians are one people connected since medieval times under Kievan Rus. According to him, Ukraine was never truly independent. It was artificially created by outsiders. The concept of historical justice frames Russia as reclaiming lands it believes rightfully belong to it. For many Russians raised on Soviet education, this narrative is deeply emotional, evoking a lost legacy supposedly stolen by the West. Putin selectively highlights historical moments that support his argument while ignoring centuries in which Ukraine functioned independently with its own language, culture, and governance. By presenting military action as correcting a historical mistake, he transforms aggression into duty, portraying himself as a protector of heritage rather than a conqueror. This narrative provides the invasion with a moral shield, appealing to national pride and legitimizing the action domestically. Chapter 2. The Kievan Rus Narrative. Putin frequently references Kievan Rus, the medieval state centered in what is now Ukraine, claiming it as the birthplace of Russian civilization. His argument is simple. If Russia began in Kiev, then Kiev belongs to Russia. Historians point out that Kievan Rus was a multi-ethnic federation, influenced by Vikings, Slavs, and local cultures. After its collapse, Ukraine and Russia developed independently. Ukraine developed its own traditions, language, and political systems, including the Cossack Hetmanate, which resisted Moscow's influence. Moscow developed under Mongol influence, forming a distinct identity. By emphasizing Kievan Rus, Putin taps into a powerful emotional narrative. Reclaiming territory becomes a moral act rather than conquest. This narrative transforms geography into destiny, erasing Ukrainian identity. Framing historical continuity as natural law, he legitimizes military action while encouraging domestic audiences to see invasion as a restorative duty, not a violation of sovereignty or international law. Chapter 3. The Soviet Legacy and Borders Argument. Another cornerstone of Putin's justification is the collapse of the Soviet Union. He claims Ukraine's current borders were unfairly drawn by leaders like Lenin and Khrushchev, giving Russia lost territories. He famously called the USSR's breakup the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This narrative portrays Ukraine as a temporary creation rather than a legitimate state. In reality, Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations in 1945 and held a strong independence movement. In 1991, over 90% of Ukrainians voted for sovereignty, including in eastern regions. By framing borders as a historical mistake, Putin positions Russia as correcting historical injustice, turning nationalism into moral righteousness. Domestically, this resonates with a sense of grievance and lost pride, justifying intervention. This argument blurs the line between history and politics, presenting invasion as restoration rather than aggression. By selectively highlighting past Soviet policies, Putin transforms historical interpretation into a strategic tool that both erodes Ukraine's legitimacy and reinforces his domestic narrative of moral duty. Chapter 4. The Russian World Ideology. Putin promotes Ruski Mir, or the Russian world, claiming all Russian-speaking people share a cultural and spiritual space regardless of borders. Protecting this civilization is framed as Russia's responsibility. Portraying Ukraine's westward drift as a threat, foreign influence is depicted as a cultural enemy attempting to erase Russian identity. Under this logic, invading Ukraine becomes defensive, preserving language, culture, and heritage. Yet many Russian-speaking Ukrainians strongly identify as Ukrainian, showing that language does not equal nationality. By linking culture to political authority, Putin uses this ideology to justify territorial claims and expansion. Shared heritage becomes a moral obligation, framing intervention as protective rather than aggressive. Domestic audiences are encouraged to see the war as a restoration of unity, blending nostalgia, pride, and history. Culture, identity, and heritage are weaponized to present aggression as morally justified, erasing Ukrainian autonomy in the eyes of Russian citizens while reinforcing nationalistic sentiment. Chapter 5. NATO as the modern villain. To strengthen his historical argument, Putin casts NATO as a persistent threat. He claims Western expansion since the 1990s endangers Russia, portraying Ukraine's Western orientation as a betrayal orchestrated by foreign powers. This creates a narrative of encirclement. Russia must act or face destruction. Domestically, it taps into historical memory, linking past invasions by Napoleon and Hitler to modern threats, framing intervention as defensive and necessary. Ukraine is depicted as a Western proxy, while Russia is the liberator. Emotionally, this narrative boosts domestic support. Intervening appears preemptive and protective rather than aggressive. In reality, Ukraine's NATO aspirations largely arose from Russian aggression, but the narrative reverses cause and effect. By blending historical grievance with contemporary security, Putin legitimizes military action as a moral duty. This merges identity, history, and politics, presenting war as both historical preservation and national defense. Chapter 6. Denying Ukrainian identity. One of Putin's most controversial claims is that Ukrainians and Russians are essentially the same people, arguing that Ukrainian identity was artificially created by the West to weaken Russia. This narrative erases centuries of culture, language, literature, and independence movements, including figures like Taras Shevchenko. Denying Ukrainian identity removes the moral argument for sovereignty, reframing Ukraine as a territory to be reclaimed rather than a nation. Military intervention becomes reunification rather than invasion. Ukraine's long history of self-governance and resistance to imperial or Soviet control is ignored. Domestically, this simplifies public perception. If a nation is not real, its rights are irrelevant. Denial of identity becomes a strategic tool, aligning history, culture, and politics to justify aggression while diminishing Ukraine's legitimacy internationally. In this narrative, invasion appears as a restoration of shared heritage, disguising modern geopolitical ambition under the guise of moral and historical duty. Chapter 7. History as a weapon. Putin shows that history can be weaponized. Military action is preceded by a narrative. Selective events support Russian claims, while contradictory facts are ignored. State media, school textbooks, ceremonies, and cultural programming reinforce that the invasion is about restoring historical justice, not expansion. Emotional storytelling convinces domestic audiences that action is moral and inevitable. History as a tool has precedent. Empires like Rome and Britain justified conquest using selective narratives. Emotional appeals often overshadow evidence, leading populations to support actions they might otherwise reject. Weaponizing history transforms ambition into a perceived moral mission, where opposition appears immoral. Identity, culture, and memory become instruments to legitimize aggression. Domestic audiences see intervention as restoration of heritage, while international observers are challenged to interpret actions as morally grounded. History becomes a battlefield, showing how narratives shape perception and policy in modern conflict. Chapter 8. Why this matters today. This war is not just about territory, it's about memory, identity, and narrative power. Putin's use of historical justice shows how history can justify aggression and erase sovereignty. Other nations could adopt similar claims, threatening global stability. International law relies on modern borders, not medieval claims, and rejecting historical arguments safeguards order. For Ukrainians, the war is both physical and cultural, defending language, traditions, and identity. Understanding Putin's narrative reveals that history is not just studied, it is a tool of political power. Leaders can redefine morality and legality to suit ambition, using selective memory to justify violence. The conflict illustrates how combining identity, emotion, and history influences modern warfare. Recognizing this helps viewers understand the stakes. Historical narratives are powerful tools, shaping both domestic opinion and international perception, proving that history can be as influential as armies and weapons in modern conflict. History should teach us, not justify war. When leaders weaponize the past, they risk repeating humanity's darkest moments. What do you think? Is Putin genuinely defending history or rewriting it for power? Let me know in the comments. If you find this video valuable, subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep history explainers.